week on Demystifying Science.
What happens when cheating becomes the dominant strategy? The tragedy of the commons happens when a valuable, shared resource is depleted due to unregulated access. In the classic example, there's a shared pasture, the commons, where farmers graze their sheep. Without any laws about how many sheep each farmer can graze, the rationally self-interested individuals will gradually increase the number of livestock they keep on the grassland until the rolling green hills become nothing but mud.
In this model, without top-down regulation, inevitable degradation of shared resources occurs because each individual can't be trusted to consider more than their immediate interests. Accelerated extraction due to a lack of regulation is assumed to be an unavoidable cost of modernity, a state of nature in which humans are agents that will always do what is best for only themselves.
But this vision of consumption is incomplete. It ignores the part of humanity that is about community, honor, ethics, morality, or generational thinking. Instead, it casts the tendency to betray one another for blood money as the baseline, rather than as an absolutely deranged sickness that periodically creeps into society.
The tragedy of the commons focuses exclusively on a vision of economic man who is purely self-interested. But this is barely a description of Homo sapiens. It's much more a description of the corporation, which has been granted legal personhood, but luckily is governed by a formalized logic that is as easily unwritten as it was originally composed.
Humanity's challenge, then, is to find ways to rewrite the laws and customs of corporate architecture in order to move into the next phase of human metamorphosis. To that end, this episode is all about how the idea that everybody cheats became the cultural narrative, how biological systems of all stripes, from humans on down to amoebas, keep cheaters from taking over, and finally, how humans can do the same in their relationship to their economic analogs, the corporation.
Chapter 1. Cheat Codes. Biological relationships always come with the risk of cheaters. Sneaky gits who figure out ways to get more than their fair share of an exchange. When there are only a few cheaters in a population, defection barely moves the needle, and life can continue as normal. But in some cases, cheating offers what scientists call a selective advantage, and that's when things get all wobbly.
That's because a selective advantage means there's going to be more cheaters in the next generation, and more in the next one after that, and the one after that, and so on until suddenly you look around and everyone is a cheat. Maybe you are too, but by that point it's too late. You can't turn back the clock. You can only die a hungry, selfish death because you've used all of your resources.
The tendency for organisms to prefer self-interest is why the phrase tragedy of the commons is engraved into the frontal lobe of anyone who's watched David Attenborough talk about overpopulation while standing in front of an anthill. Cheating is why we can't have nice things. Nature is red in the tooth and claw, son. It's all about survival of the fittest, and the biggest, meanest creature is going to reproduce the most, so you better take more than your fair share as fast as possible because someone else might do it first.
But that actually doesn't make any sense. It's the exact opposite of the successful strategies that are widespread in biology, as evidenced by the sheer number of species where collaboration is central to survival. Wolves hunt in packs, bees tend to a queen's reproductive needs, fish travel in schools to confuse predators, and bacteria form complex biofilms. Somehow, without any top-down control, these animals manage to avoid the tragedy of the commons, despite the fact that the ability to defect is never far away.
Under the right conditions, bacteria can start stealing scrap metal from each other. Amoebas can make fruiting bodies that'll not again produce another fruiting body. Little janitor fish clean larger fish and can develop a taste for their host's flesh, and worker wasps can decide that they don't want to work anymore. All examples we'll look at more closely in just a minute.
But before we talk about those, hold on a second. Are you telling me that the tragedy of the commons never happens?
Not exactly. I'm saying that it doesn't have to happen. In fact, it often doesn't, which means it might be possible to avoid it if you can make a model for what makes it happen versus what keeps it from happening.
And it's happening in humans?
No, sometimes. It's complicated. We'll talk about it in chapter 3. The point right now is that cheating happens in nature all over the place. But cheaters rarely take over and destroy a wild population. This suggests that something is missing in the standard model, which assumes that human interactions are all about who can cheat most effectively. So, before we can talk about the tragedy of the commons in humans and how to avoid it, we have to talk about how biology uses incentives to keep uncooperative behavior under control.
Chapter 2. Make 'em pay. If all creatures on Earth were motivated exclusively by a desire to increase their chances of going forth and covering the world with their offspring, you'd expect to see individuals defecting from their group all over the place, hoping that they could play the system and win.
While this behavior can emerge in the laboratory, it's actually much rarer in the wild. Which raises the question, if cheating is so rational and rationality is so good, why aren't there defectors overrunning every interaction in nature?
In a word, incentives. If you want to use 2 words, negative incentives. Cheaters can only benefit themselves at the expense of everyone else in the community when there are no consequences for bad behavior. In a community where organisms encounter each other over and over again for generations, ramifications for bad behavior evolve as readily as does defection itself, creating a disincentive for roguery.
That's exactly right. Consider the example of bacteria, creatures that often solve the problem of nutrient limitation through the production of public goods that help scavenge resources from the environment. Think digestive enzymes that dissolve a piece of meat into smaller molecules that can then be digested by the mouthless bacteria. Or molecules that collect iron and bring it back to the cell to be inserted into all sorts of electrically conductive proteins.
Once they're released into the world, these compounds don't necessarily come back to the exact cell that produced them. It's more that with everyone making them, there's plenty to go around. But some individuals could easily decide to skate by on the public goods that others are making. Like the friend who never has cash for gas, but always wants a ride.
It's a great strategy on one hand, since the cheaters will grow much faster than all the other bacteria that are wasting their precious metabolic resources on manufacturing. But it's also a terrible strategy since it will eventually lead to a tragedy of the commons, where the vast majority of the population is unable to produce a good that's necessary for survival. Then, they die.
To prevent the downward spiral, bacteria have evolved negative incentives that keep down the number of cheaters. Some have found ways to produce public goods only in areas that cheaters don't have access to, which isolates the benefit. In other cases, they just straight up produce poisons, the antidote for which can only be produced if you also happen to be making the public good.
Microbes aren't the only ones that have figured this out. The social amoeba,
Dictyostelium discoideum,
spends much of its life as a free-living organism, scavenging its water world for tasty morsels. When it looks like the good times are about to be gone, a signal goes out. It's time to slug.
Amoebas from all corners come together into a multi-celled aggregate, the slug, and start the costly process of producing a fruiting body that will ensure survival through the coming hard times. It consists of a thin stalk, just a few cells tall, that holds up a little elf hat of spores, little vessels that will survive until a time when resources are once again abundant.
Metamorphosis of the slug does not treat all cells equally well. Nearly 20% will sacrifice themselves to make the stalk, while the other 80% become spores, which, if it was all amoebas that were equally cooperative, wouldn't be that bad. Over the course of many generations, you'd contribute to the spores and to the stalks, and all that sacrifice would be water under the bridge.
Unequal cooperation, though, is an entirely different matter. Slug mutants that aren't interested in stock formation end up as spores disproportionately often. After a few generations of this kind of trickery, they would far outnumber the cells that were interested in making stocks. And the next time resources ran out and the time to slug call went out, the cheater amoebas would just shrug their little ectoplasmic shoulders and go on with their lives. That is, until their lives are ended because they failed to sporulate.
Collapse of the population is prevented by a series of slug filters that incentivize collaboration. In one case, you can only become part of the fruiting body if you're part of a closely related group. This decreases the likelihood of ending up in a fruiting body with an individual that has lost the gene for stock formation, and so will stick you with the sacrifice while coasting to the next generation.
In other cases, discoideum can evolve in such a way that vital functions require the presence of cooperation genes, which decrease the likelihood that a cheater can lose them and still benefit. And finally, they can also develop methods that randomize the stock spore lottery, which means that you never even have the chance to cheat in the first place.
Blue streak cleaner wrasses, coral reef janitor fish that eat parasites off of larger species, are perfectly happy to take whole bites of their client's flesh, but only if there isn't a negative incentive of, I'll eat you if you bite me again.
In all of these examples, the possibility for cheating is always there, but populations generally don't collapse into a tragedy of the commons. This isn't because the creatures are moral, nor because they coordinate with each other to all do the right thing, nor because they have a book where it's written that they shouldn't cheat. It's because they've evolved strategies that make cheating too expensive.
That leaves us with just one last piece. What does this all mean for the human commons?
Chapter 3. Humanation or Corpora Man? If you take the word of Garrett Hardin, the ecologist who wrote the essay that lodged the worm of the tragedy of the commons into the collective brain of Western humans, then Homo sapiens are destined for tragedy unless there's a government around that will prevent them from cheating on one another.
According to Hardin, escape from the escalating chaos of an unregulated commons can never be accomplished through negotiations or appeals to conscience. It can only be stopped by coercion from above, which he reminds us, quote, is a dirty word to most liberals now, but it need not forever be so.
In direct opposition to his read on the situation is the work of Elinor Ostrom, who won a Nobel Prize in economics for her work on human cooperation. She discovered groups of people all around the world managing scarce resources, fisheries in Maine and Indonesia, irrigation systems in Nepal and Spain, mountain villages in Japan and the Swiss Alps, without running into ruin.
Ostrom's work demonstrated that humans, when confronted with scarcity, can implement cooperative strategies without top-down intervention. The alternative systems she observed were based on trust, communication, and social incentives. In a community where the stakeholders all know each other, social repercussions for betraying the group are a powerful motivation.
What this suggests is that the presence of strong social bonds that emerge from shared culture allows Homo sapiens to manage scarce resources for generations, which doesn't exactly square with Homo economicus, the model of humans as totally rational, self-interested beings that will always choose themselves over the group, which motivates the tragedy of the commons.
If Homo economicus is a corporation rather than a human, it's a different story. Then there's an exchange happening between two very different kinds of people, real live fleshy humans and legal only persons. Humans are interested in many different aspects of existence, only one of which is money, while a corporation's sole reason for being is to bring profits to shareholders.
What this means is that there isn't a shared value structure that is foundational for establishing cooperation, let alone the kind of reciprocal leverage that's needed for social pressure to be effective. Which is probably why much of modern life can feel like it's a perpetual battle between Homo sapiens and Homo economicus. And it can also feel like the humans are losing because companies are bigger, stronger, and faster. They're also richer, as evidenced by the stack of legal protections that have been purchased by armies of well-paid lawyers.
Overwhelming as this may all seem, there's hope. Concerted action of devoted groups like Corporate Accountability has eked out victories against Nestle, Big Tobacco, nuclear weapons manufacturers, and McDonald's, amongst others. They've also recently started the Corporate Accountability Action League, whose goal is to prevent the endless revolving door between the boardroom and the Capitol.
Judgments against Chevron successfully levied a $9 billion fine against the oil company for poisoning the water supply and soil of 30,000 Ecuadorians living in the area around the Lago Agrio oil field. British Petroleum was fined $20 billion for the Deepwater Horizon spill. Volkswagen was fined nearly $15 billion for doctoring emissions tests on their vehicles. The list goes on and on and on, and it goes to show that humans can find ways to create powerful negative incentives for corporations.
Stemming cheating can seem insurmountable since corporations are such a massive force in society, but the world is changing. Consumer mindsets have shifted to prefer a more responsible version of the corporation than in the past. Rubin and Carmichael at the University of Virginia studied this trend and found that 68% of those surveyed said it's more important to know how companies operate than what they sell. 94% said companies can shape a better society. 87% said most companies exist to create value for multiple interests in society, rather than just profit alone. And 75% said they converted these opinions of a company into real action.
All of which are strong indications of the fact that rewiring the corporate software is possible, and suggests that anyone who tells you that it's hopeless either hasn't done their homework or wants you to be afraid. Corporations are an invention of humans, performing the actions they have been programmed to do. If suddenly Homo sapiens decided to rewrite that software, no one could stop them.
We've got a lot more to say about this topic, so subscribe for more episodes that look to nature in order to model some very human problems. We've got everyone from hypnotists to mathematical physicists to recording engineers, even human rights lawyers on the line.
And in the conversation that follows here, Joel Corcoran, lawyer, scientist, political consultant, made a strong argument for the fact that the legal system is the best way that you humans can get things back under control. The best part of it is, according to him, it's not even going to be that hard. So check it out and get inspired. Let's do some good, you know? See you next week, humans.
Bye.
Bye.
To affect change in this country, you need 1 million people and $10 million. We could pull together a political action committee that said, we are all going to agree to disagree on political issues and set those aside. And we're going to focus on one single thing. We will support elected officials, or maybe even appointed officials, who focus first on problem solving, who are friendly, who work with people who disagree with them, and actually try to come to some policy solution rather than arguing about who's going to win the next election or not. I still think there's the ability for we the people to get together and make change.